everyone, welcome back to Chapter 2 of Disruptive Behavior Disorders, Influences of Gene-Environment Interaction and Correlation on Disruptive Behavior in the Family Context. So remember, in Chapter 1, we had some additional readings because, as I said, that wasn't very substantive. There wasn't a whole lot of information in Chapter 1. And then we get to Chapter 2 and it's like, bam, now it's really difficult and dense material. So we don't have any additional reading materials for this chapter. So I'm not an expert in behavioral genetics. I'm not an expert in molecular genetics, but I'm going to do the best that I can to explain this chapter for you guys. So bear with me. So our objectives for today, we're going to identify and explain the different approaches to disruptive behavior. We're going to review the gene-environment interplay in the development of disruptive behaviors. We're going to understand and explain quantitative genetic studies. We're going to understand and explain molecular genetics. We're going to explain genotype-environment correlation. We're going to explain genotype times environment interaction. And we're going to summarize the evidence of these two. So let's talk approaches to development of disruptive behavior. There's 3 different types of approaches, and the first is additive. And additive says that there's different developmental influences that work together, but they each produce independent effects. So what they're saying is that you have your genetics and you have your environment, and they work together to produce some type of behavior. In this case, we're going to talk about disruptive behaviors. But each of those, your genetics and your environment, produce separate results. They're very distinct and they can be parsed out. The interactionist theory says that there's different developmental influences that produce a joint effect on the development of disruptive behaviors through moderation, modifying, or amplifying the influence of other developmental influences. So basically what this is saying is that you have genetics and environment again, and they work together to produce one effect, but one makes the other more potent. So you might have that genetic component, and it makes the environmental component more potent, or vice versa. You have the environmental component that makes that genetic component more potent. And when we're talking about genes and environment, at the heart of it is really that psychological debate of nature versus nurture. Nature being your genetics and nurture being your environment. And in terms of psychology, the prevailing theory is nature via nurture. So you have this nature, you have this genetic predisposition, and it becomes activated because of something in your environment. So let's take the gene for addiction. So you might have 2 siblings who have both been passed on this addiction gene, but only one of them becomes an alcoholic, for example. And it might be because there is something in that environment that kickstarted that gene into activation. So that sibling may have had some type of trauma, they may have been assaulted, they may have been a car accident, maybe they lost a loved one, a sibling, a parent, or a significant other, and that affects them differently than it affects the other sibling. And that nature via nurture is very similar to this interactionist perspective. And the last one is transactional. You have different developmental factors that influence each other and the disruptive behaviors across development. So what this is saying is that nature and nurture are constantly changing each other and changing the disruptive behaviors. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later in this chapter. Gene-environment interplay is basically genetics and environmental influences act together in the development of disruptive behaviors. So we know that disruptive behaviors occur. We don't know exactly why or how, but we know that both genes and environmental influences play a part and they interact with each other. And this interplay takes account the changes that occur in these interactions over time. So the way that our genes and our environment interacts and causes disruptive behaviors when we're very young, say ages 3 to 5, is going to be very different than in our late adolescence, say 18 to 21. And this does occur along multiple levels. So the environmental influences may moderate or make less extreme the functional roles that genes play. So if you have this gene or this genetic predisposition to these disruptive behaviors, but if you have an environment that is very nurturing and loving, very calm and stable, it may make the those genes and those disruptive behaviors that are caused by those genes a little bit less severe. On a cellular level, genes may change the internal environment factors. So we're talking about things such as your hormones and your neurotransmitters. The gene environment and environmental influences. There's a correlation of gene environment that may moderate the effect of environmental influences on development later. As we said, if you have this genetic predisposition, your environment could moderate that and make it less severe. Severe disruptive behaviors such as conduct disorder and substance abuse may result as that interaction from the genes and the environment. And gene environment interplay sees disruptive behaviors as a family issue. Families help control how and when the gene influence operates, and they do this through the environment that they raise the kid in. So when we're talking about disruptive behaviors, it's not in isolation at school and it's not in isolation at home, but it is seen as a family issue because the family plays a large role in when and how those genes get activated. Quantitative genetics is one of the ways that we study this gene-environment interplay. And quantitative genetics use twin studies, adoption studies, and sibling studies to estimate the genetic and environmental influences on behavior. And they use a top-down approach, so they go from theories to determining actual models. And they do have some assumptions that they use in these models. And they infer variables from the data to build these models. This entire chapter talks a lot about phenotypes. And phenotypes is just the actual trait or characteristic that gets displayed from your genes. So whenever they mention phenotype in this chapter, they're actually talking specifically about disruptive behaviors. And it's attributed to genetics, shared environmental influences, and non-shared environmental influences. And how they do this is they determine this by looking at the dominant and the recessive alleles on genes. So they try to determine whether something is caused by either the environment or genetics based on twin studies and sibling studies. So remember that monozygotic or identical twins share 100% of their DNA. Fraternal or dizygotic twins and siblings share 50%. But the shared environmental influence is latent or it's hidden. And it's an influence that represents all non-genetic influences that causes a likeness and disruptive behavior between family members. So if we're talking about something that's not genetically caused, then they're talking about those hidden shared environmental factors because siblings are typically raised in the same environment. So when we talk about these shared environmental factors, they have a correlation of 1. So remember, a correlation goes from either +1 to -1, and the closer it is to 1, the stronger correlation there is. So siblings have a correlation of 1 for shared environmental influences when they live in the same house. Non-shared environmental influences are a hidden influence that contributes to differences for family members in disruptive behavior. So that makes sense. If it's a shared environment, then you expect both siblings to have it. If it's a non-shared environment, then you expect the sibling who is experiencing that non-shared environment to display the disruptive behavior. So if there is a correlation between identical and fraternal twins and full siblings, that's equal. So if the correlation between full siblings is the same as for identical twins, is the same as fraternal twins, then they say that that is set to be environmental. They also say that if there's a correlation for unrelated siblings, then that disruptive behavior is set to be environmental. This does take some specific assumptions though. So it says that the environment is same for the same amount of similar for twins and siblings. So what this basically means is that if you have twins versus siblings, the environment is the same for twins as it would be the same for siblings. That amount of sameness isn't going to vary just because one set is twins and one set as non-twin siblings. And they also take into account the fact what they call assertive mating. And what this means is that people who have similar characteristics tend to mate. So if you have somebody who's aggressive, they may tend to marry or gravitate and reproduce with somebody who is also aggressive. So when you have two people that have those very similar traits, they're more likely to have offspring that have this trait as well. In terms of this assumption, though, they get around this by looking at unrelated siblings. So if you have unrelated siblings, then they kind of assume that assertive mating isn't happening across the board with all of the offspring of one person. So what they're saying is that they might have one brother and sister who has assertive mating, so they both have parents who are aggressive. And then they have an unrelated sibling, so they might have somebody who's like a step sibling. And that helps to determine whether it's environmental or whether it's genetic. Because if you have a step sibling who is raised in the same environment and they become aggressive or have these disruptive behaviors, then they're more likely to say that it's environmental. If they don't have it, then they're more likely to say that it is genetic. Molecular genetics assumes that the structure of DNA affects behavior. They use a bottom-up approach, so they use a method to theory approach in which they examine how specific genes influence behavior. And their approach is data-driven. So a genome is scanned to find associations between individual genes and the phenotype. So they're looking for individual genes that are related to disruptive behaviors. And the genes that they found relate to serotonin and dopamine systems, as we talked about in the previous lecture. The serotonin and the dopamine systems have been implicated in the cause of disruptive behaviors, but they haven't been able to find one specific gene. And part of the problem is that they know that the expression of genes can change throughout the development. So a gene might look different, as I said, in the early development, ages 3 to 5 versus 18 to 21. They also talk about methylation, and methylation is just turning off a gene. And epigenetics is a large area of study where it looks at the way that the behavior and the environment influence how your genes work. So we've been talking about the way that genes and environment interact with each other to cause behavior. Epigenetics looks at behavior and environment and the influence that it has on your genes. Depending on the study, there is a variability of influence estimates. So based on the study, some studies might say that genetics causes more of the disruptive behaviors, and other studies may say that it's more environment. But there's a couple of reasons for this. So in middle childhood, 13 to 94% of the variants showed genetic influence. That's a really large proportion. But less than 62% showed environmental differences. And there's no explanation for why that 13 to 94% is so large. But the theories include the definition, the age, and error, the measurement of disruptive behaviors, and sibling types. So they say that any of those factors can account for why that middle childhood variance is so large, from 13 to 94%. And the type of behavior, they're talking about aggressive antisocial behavior and non-aggressive antisocial behavior. So 48% of genetic influence for non-aggressive antisocial behavior, and the rest was a combination of shared and non-shared environmental influences. So that's a pretty big percent for non-aggressive antisocial behavior. For aggressive behavior, genetics and non-shared environmental influences accounted for 65%, and shared environmental influences only accounted for 5%. And the shared environmental influences explain the etiology of non-aggressive behaviors more than aggressive behaviors. So based on this data, it makes it seem like aggressive behaviors tend to be more genetic and non-aggressive behaviors tend to be more environmental. And we do have internalizing and externalizing. And they talk about liability. And liability is just a term that describes the collective genetic and environmental influence. When we're talking about externalizing problems, we're more talking about ADHD, ODD, and CD, and then a separate internalizing problem for anxiety, depression, and phobia. Both of these internalizing and externalizing symptoms can be seen in childhood, and the environment plays a large role in which disruptive behavior is manifested. So is it going to be primarily internalizing or primarily externalizing symptoms that a child shows? And the environment plays a large role in determining which one becomes manifested. And age also plays a large role. Genetic and non-shared environmental influences increase from adolescence to adulthood, whereas shared environmental influences decrease, and where shared environmental influences decrease. However, other studies have showed that genetic and shared environmental influences decrease and non-shared environmental influences increase. And the inconsistency is the way that they make up the age. So we're talking about disruptive behavior and this variance, and they're saying, oh, age is one of the reasons. But then even within age, there's a lot of variance. So sometimes they group kids as early, middle, and late adolescence. Early childhood, middle childhood, and then middle and late adolescence. Others just say childhood, adolescence. So there's a lot of variability in what the age is determined as. In early and middle childhood, there's no difference from aggressive and non-aggressive behaviors. But in adolescence, genetic influences were stronger for aggression, and shared environmental influences were stronger for rule breaking. So here, it seems that genetics are responsible for aggressive behavior, but the environment is responsible for rule breaking, so things like maybe being truant or staying out at night. Genetic influences on aggression increased with age, while shared environmental influences decreased. However, genetic influences on rule breaking decreased with age, and shared environmental influences remained stable. Genetic influences for aggression increase during adolescence, whereas environmental factors increase for non-aggressive behaviors. So again, it seems like genetics is more responsible for those aggressive behaviors, and for things that aren't aggressive, like rule breaking, it's the environment that causes those. Genetic influences contribute to the stability of disruptive behaviors. Environmental influences have age-specific effects. Genetics have an influence on disregard for rules across early childhood, but the effects for the environment were age-specific. Genetic and shared environmental factors influence the stability of aggression in children who have conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder from ages 11 to 14. Solely genetic influences for antisocial behavior are responsible from middle to late adolescence. And middle childhood is really important. So the early onset of disruptive behaviors makes it more severe, but the shared environmental influences were greater on externalizing behavior in middle childhood, whereas genetics had more influence in adolescence. And genetic influence increased from 10 to 18, and shared environmental influences decreased. So that middle childhood is really important for when genetics start to have some effect on disruptive behaviors. Okay, so here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. Conceptualizing gene-environment correlation and interaction. So genotype-environment correlation is just a correlation between genes and the environment. But there's three types. There's passive. So parents pass on genes to their offspring, and they also provide an environment that correlates with the characteristics of the offspring. So basically what that's saying is that you have aggressive behaviors that are passed on to the child, and they're also raised in an environment where there's aggressive behaviors. In active, you have individuals that seek out environments that correlate with their characteristics. So you have somebody who might be disruptive, they might have that aggressive, disruptive behavior, and then they seek out an environment that is disruptive and aggressive. And the last is evocative. Evocative, where individuals evoke responses from the environment because of their characteristics. So this might be you have a child who has this aggressive genetic predisposition, and when they display that aggression, it evokes something from the parent. So it might cause the parent to react with negativity or criticism. And that is what they call the RGE. In R, little r with the italics, is our correlation coefficient. So it's basically just saying that that's the correlation coefficient for gene environment. Genotype times environment interaction tests whether genetic factors decrease the influence of environmental factors or vice versa. So do genetics moderate environmental factors, or do environmental factors moderate the genes? Do they make those behaviors less likely to occur? So there's some evidence for gene-environment correlation and interaction. And the first is quantitative genetic studies. Genetic influences account for a large proportion of the correlation between negative parenting and child or adolescent adjustment. So there is a correlation between genetics, so passing on genes for those disruptive behaviors, and negative parenting. Temperament also plays a part. Adolescents' aggressive temperament evokes negative parenting. That helps shape antisocial behavior. Genetic influences are responsible for the correlation between environmental risk, so trauma, negative experiences, that bad parenting, and externalizing behaviors. So they're predisposed to that gene, and then exposure to those environments help to cause those externalizing behaviors. Longitudinal studies show that there's a correlation between parent-child conflict in early adolescence and externalizing behaviors in mid-adolescence. So if parents and children have conflict in early adolescence, that can predict that that adolescent is going to have some externalizing behavior issues. This suggests that there's an evocative gene-environment correlation that goes along with this, as the gene is predisposed, and then displaying that gene, so displaying that disruptive behavior, evokes a reaction in the parent that then affects the environment. Twin studies also help us get a little bit more evidence of gene-environment correlation and interaction. And they use the parents who are twins to make this relationship more clear. So usually you study the children who are twins, but in this instance, they're studying the parents. And this is because there's the transmission of conduct problems in boys that has a direct environmental influence. However, genetics and environment are confounded in girls. And this shows that it is passive. Alcohol use disorder from parent to child has all genetic influences. So the Extended Children of Twins study uses the parents who are twins and children who are twins to help make this relationship more clear. They can distinguish between evocative and passive genetic environment correlation. And it shows that it's evocative because the siblings of differing genetic relatedness. So one can estimate the influence of children's genes on their parents' behavior and on their own behavior. So when we look at children who are twins, they share either 50% or 100% of their DNA. But when we look at the children of parents who are twins, their genetic relatedness is a little bit less. So it gives a better idea of their behavior, whether it's caused by genetic influences or environmental. This can also show when it's passive gene-environment correlation because of the influence on the parent's gene and the environmental influence on their behavior and the children's behavior. So it can show both passive and evocative. Evocative gene-environment correlation causes an association between externalizing problems and maternal criticism. So that makes sense. If you have constant maternal criticism, then you might have external problems. Paternal criticism has a dire environmental effect, making externalizing problems worse. The father impacts the child's behavior. The child impacts the mother's parenting. The limit is that it can't test whether genetic predispositions moderate effects of environment, but it can test the other way. So it can test whether the environmental influence affects or moderates genetics. And they did find that criticism and warmth moderate genetic influences on aggressive and non-aggressive forms of antisocial behavior. So we talked about that a little bit earlier. If you have that genetic predisposition to be aggressive or disruptive behaviors, but you're brought up in this warm and caring environment, it's going to make the expression of those genes a little bit less potent. However, the more negative the environment, the greater genetic influence for antisocial behavior, which makes sense. If you're raised in an environment that is constantly harsh and criticizing, then you're going to have that genetic predisposition expressed more. And genetic influences tend to be greater in the face of environmental adversity. So those could be things like domestic violence, poverty, any of those situations which already make both genetic and environmental predispositions worse. Adoption studies also give us evidence because it's a natural break in those confounding variables. And think back to your experiments in your research methods. So confounding variable, you have your independent and you have your dependent, and you're manipulating it. Well, the confounding variable might be that third variable that causes the effect even though you're not studying that. So adoption studies breaks that because you don't have that genetic influence. There's a similarity between adoptive and biological children, yields environmental influence. So if you have a family who has one child who's biological and one who is adoptive, and they're similar, then that means that the effect is from environmental influences. If there's similarity between the biological parent and the adoptive parent, it yields genetic influence. So you might have an adoptive parent who has some disruptive behaviors, and you also have your biological parent who has disruptive behaviors. If both of them have that, then it shows that there's a genetic influence. The similarity between biological parents and adoptive parents yields an evocative gene-environment correlation. Because that biological risk, that gene for disruptive behaviors, is evoking negative responses from the parent. Children get genetic risk from the biological parents, and in turn, they evoke more negative controlling behaviors in their adoptive parents, showing that it is evocative. It also shows that passive gene-environment correlation operates at all ages, but adolescent antisocial behavior suggests shared environmental influences that contribute to the stability of antisocial behavior. They also found that maternal depression is a shared environmental risk factor for disruptive behavior. In adolescence, parent-child conflict predicted conduct problems, as we had said earlier, but conduct problems did not predict later parent-child conflict, making evocative gene-environment correlation the most likely model. So the fact that those behaviors evoked a response show that it is evocative. There's evidence for the gene-environment interaction because children who have both an adoptive and a biological parent with psychopathology are more likely to develop psychopathology. Birth parent substance abuse and antisocial behavior and depressive and anxious adoptive parents resulted in novelty seeking during frustration tasks in infants. So basically what this means is that if you have birth parents who have some type of psychopathology and substance abuse, and then you have adoptive parents who are depressive or anxious, it changes the way that the child acts during frustration tasks. So when they're presented with a task, they tend to seek more thrill-seeking or novelty-seeking actions. Molecular genetics studies that measures the genes associated with behavior in genes that interact with the environment to influence behavior. And there are three types: candidate, linkage, and associate. Candidate gene approach is hypothesis driven. Specific genes are chosen because of hypothesized or known biological functions that influence the development of disruptive behaviors. Linkage and associate approaches are data driven. Large portions of the genome are scanned and processed to identify regions that are associated with disruptive behavior. Specifically, linkage studies compares frequency of alleles across similarly affected family members. So they look at the genes of family members and they say how many alleles each of those family members have for that specific disruptive behavior. This works well for identifying single regions or genes. But as we know, disruptive behavior is not caused by one single gene. So they use genome-wide, I can't speak all of a sudden, associate studies, or GWAS. This scans the entire genome instead of just regions. The association with a specific gene variant and the phenotype suggests gene-environment correlation. But an interaction between a specific gene variant and environmental factor indicates a gene-environment interaction. GWAS studies focus on that gene-environment interaction. And we talked earlier about specific genes and systems. So we talked about the serotonin, the dopamine, and the GABA systems. And they're all implicated in disruptive behavior. In terms of dopamine, the genes interact with the environmental factors to develop disruptive behaviors. GABA has a specific receptor, GABRA2, that's associated with disruptive behaviors and substance abuse. However, parental monitoring may moderate the effect of GABRA2 in externalizing problems. So again, that environmental influence might actually make the outcome of genetics less. Serotonin affects behavior through changes in the stress response system. Alleles in a serotonin transporter receptor gene create a sensitivity to environmental factors. So what that means is that serotonin makes it more likely that that gene is going to become active because of environmental factors, so trauma or some type of adversity. More externalizing behaviors occur if there's a long variant of this allele or the short variant and a parent who has alcoholism. So either of those means that disruptive behaviors are more likely to occur. MAOA, which we said is a specific enzyme, degrades neurotransmitters, so it makes them disappear from the fluid in your brain. And it specifically degrades serotonin, so there is more serotonin in your brain. And let me rephrase that. It degrades neurotransmitters. Serotonin, however, does not degrade, so there's more serotonin in your brain. Specific alleles of MAOA and maternal disengagement predict violent delinquency. So if you have the specific alleles for this enzyme and you have a mother who's just not very interested in raising you, it predicts violent delinquency. Low levels of this MAOA allele combined with sexual abuse or harsh parenting also predicts disruptive behaviors. So bringing together quantitative and molecular genetic findings, there are some controversies. So quantitative genetic studies state that finding increased genetic influence on phenotypes, specifically disruptive behavior, identifies it as a good candidate for molecular genetic studies. Molecular genetic studies help interpret quantitative genetic studies. However, detecting that genetic influence doesn't tell which gene causes it or how that gene causes it. So while both of these have some support and they have interaction between them to help identify what those genes could be, it doesn't tell us what that specific gene is, and it doesn't tell us how that gene acts to cause disruptive behaviors. The GWAS studies have helped get molecular genetic findings closer to results from quantitative genetics studies. So as we said, it's a little bit better because it studies the whole genome. But we do have to bridge that gap. So investigating polygene or more than one gene correlations and interactions with the gene environment correlation and interaction is the next step. So we have to examine gene clusters or variants with similar effects with both gene and gene environment and interactions. That will help explain the role of genes in behavior. So basically what this is saying is that we have to take all these approaches that we've just been talking about and see how we can bring them all together to explain how disruptive behaviors occur. And then we have to have an integrative transactional approach. So we have to look at all these factors that you see in this picture here. Genetic risk, influencing prenatal risk, neuroendocrine dysregulation. So when they talk about neuroendocrine dysregulation, they're talking about our hypothalamus pituitary adrenal system, and this is what releases cortisol in relation to stress. It talks about parenting, the link between parenting and that neuroendocrine dysregulation, so having too much of that stress hormone, externalizing problems in parents. There is some support. Genetic influences on externalizing problems, poor mental health prenatally, are all associated with disruptive behaviors. Substance abuse prenatally is associated with substance use disorder. Prenatal mental health predicts neuroendocrine dysregulation. And neuroendocrine dysregulation is a biological risk for disruptive behaviors. So future directions. Multiple genes. We have to understand how multiple genes impact development. We have to reconcile different designs across different approaches, and the GWAS is one of the ways to do this. Family issues. So the importance of including both parents and children's genes to understand the transmission of genes and parenting behaviors and how they contribute to disruptive behaviors. And interdisciplinary work. We have to work across fields, like the model in the previous slide, to discover how genetics, hormones, and family environmental factors combine to produce disruptive behaviors. So this means that biologists, geneticists, behavioralists, psychologists, and educators all have to work together to determine how exactly disruptive behaviors are formed. I know this was a dense one and I'm losing my voice. I apologize. I'll see you guys for the next one.